The millionaire's mother digs her own grave under the cruel threat of her son's wife. Family secrets buried for years emerge when the elderly woman discovers a truth capable of destroying everything. But before the earth covers her completely, something surprising happens. And what would have been a silent tragedy becomes the beginning of a legacy of courage, love, and redemption. If you're intrigued by this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. Dusk was falling slowly over the rural outskirts of Oak Creek, in the heart of Northern California, bringing with it that heavy silence only the countryside knows. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the orange sky seemed hand-painted, as if nature wanted to put on one last show before complete darkness. But not even all the beauty of that moment could hide what was about to happen on that isolated piece of land, far from the prying eyes of the city. Eleanor knelt on the damp earth, feeling the weight of her 68 years in every movement. Her hands trembled as she held the shovel that had been handed to her minutes before. Mud clung to her fingers, to her simple clothes, to her face marked by time and by the tears that wouldn't stop streaming down. She tried to understand how she had gotten here, how everything had crumbled so quickly. Her voice came out weak, almost a desperate whisper. "Please, Natalie, don't do this to me. I'm your husband's mother. I've never done you any harm." Natalie stood a few feet away, watching her mother-in-law with cold eyes and an expression that mixed anger, fear, and determination. She gripped another shovel tightly, her knuckles white around the wooden handle. Her dark hair was tied back in a hasty bun, and her expensive clothes, once impeccable, were now stained with dirt. She breathed heavily, as if fighting an internal battle with herself. "Shut up, Eleanor. Just shut your mouth." Natalie's voice came out louder than she intended, echoing across the empty land. "You don't understand anything, nothing. You were going to destroy everything I've built." Eleanor tried to stand up, but her legs failed her. She fell to her knees again, the physical pain mixing with the terror that was taking over her entire being. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be the same woman who years ago had joined the family with a shy smile and promises of eternal love for her son. "Natalie, think about Peter. Think about your son. He needs you. He needs his grandmother." Upon hearing the boy's name, Natalie hesitated for a moment. Her eyes flickered with something that might have been regret, but the hardness soon returned to her face. She took another step toward her mother-in-law, the shovel still firm in her hands. "It's precisely because of him that I'm doing this, to protect my son, to protect my family." But that brutal scene, that moment of desperation and madness, was merely the climax of a story that had begun much earlier, within the luxurious walls of the mansion where silence always said much more than any words. 6 months earlier, Eleanor's life was very different. She lived in the house of her son Edward, a successful entrepreneur who had built an empire in the tech industry. The mansion was in a gated community in Oak Creek, with immense gardens, a heated pool, and a privileged view of the surrounding hills. It was the kind of place she never imagined she would see in her life, let alone live in. Eleanor had always been a simple woman. Born and raised in a small town in rural Ohio, she had worked her whole life as a seamstress, raising Edward alone after her husband left her when the boy was only 3. They were difficult years, full of sacrifice and hardship, but she never allowed her son to go without. She saved every penny, woke up before sunrise to take on more orders, and stayed up late at night, finishing party dresses, baptismal gowns, and school uniforms. Edward grew up watching his mother work tirelessly for him, and that shaped the man he became. Determined, intelligent, and ambitious, he studied on a full scholarship, graduated with a degree in computer engineering, and by the age of 30, already had his own software development company. By 35, he was a millionaire. And the first thing he did when the money started rolling in was to go get his mother from that simple little house in Ohio and bring her to live with him. "Mum, you raised me all by yourself. Now it's my turn to take care of you," he had said that day, his eyes shining with emotion. Eleanor was reluctant at first. She didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to get in the way of her son's life, who had recently married Natalie, a beautiful and elegant woman he had met at a business event. But Edward insisted so much that she finally accepted. And so at 67, Eleanor moved into that enormous mansion where everything seemed too big, too quiet. In the first few months, she tried to adapt. She woke up early as she always had, but there were no clothes to sew. She tried to help in the kitchen, but the family had staff for everything. She felt useless, lost in that world of luxury that wasn't hers. The only thing that kept her happy was the presence of her little grandson, Peter, who was only 5 at the time. Peter was a special child, quiet, observant, overly sensitive for his age. He didn't talk much, preferring to draw and be silent, but his brown eyes said everything. He became attached to his grandmother from the very first day, and Eleanor found in that boy the purpose she had been missing. She spent hours playing with him, telling him stories, teaching him simple things she had learned growing up in the country. Peter smiled with her in a way he didn't smile with anyone else. But Eleanor noticed something strange. Natalie treated her son with a coldness she couldn't understand. The woman was polite, always well-dressed, spoke in a polished manner, but there was a distance between her and the boy that bothered the grandmother. Natalie rarely hugged Peter, rarely sat with him to play or listen to his stories. She always seemed too busy, always with important commitments, always on the phone handling matters Eleanor didn't even understand. "That's just her way, Mum," Edward would justify whenever his mother delicately brought it up. "Natalie is a modern, independent woman. She loves Peter in her own way." Eleanor didn't push, but the feeling that something wasn't right continued to grow in her chest. She saw her grandson seek his mother's attention only to be ignored. She saw the boy bring her drawings he had made, and Natalie would just pat him on the head before returning to her phone. It hurt the grandmother, but she didn't know what to do. It wasn't her house, not her family to interfere with. She was just a guest in this world that didn't belong to her. As the weeks went by, Eleanor began to notice other details. Natalie would get irritated whenever her mother-in-law spent too much time with Peter. She would make subtle comments, almost imperceptible, but they stung. "You're spoiling the boy too much, Eleanor. Peter needs to learn to be independent. You're attached to him all the time. Edward, tell your mother not to give Peter so many sweets. He'll get used to it." Eleanor tried to hold back, to swallow her hurt, but it was difficult. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just loving her grandson in the only way she knew how, with presence, with affection, with attention. But she realized that her presence was bothering Natalie more and more. One afternoon in March, Eleanor was in the kitchen baking a carrot cake, the recipe Peter loved most. The boy was sitting on the counter next to her, smeared with batter, laughing quietly as he told her about a cartoon he had watched that morning. It was one of those simple moments that filled the grandmother's heart with happiness. Natalie entered the kitchen suddenly, her cell phone glued to her ear. She gave a quick wave to the two of them and went out the back door, heading toward the garden. Eleanor didn't pay much attention at first, continuing to mix the batter while listening to Peter talk. But then by chance she heard Natalie's voice coming from the garden. The woman was speaking loudly, nervously, and although she was far away, the wind carried some words into the kitchen. I know, but he can't find out. Ever. If Edward finds out the truth, I lose everything." Eleanor stopped mixing the batter. Her heart began to beat faster. She looked at Peter, who remained oblivious, humming softly. The grandmother slowly approached the window, trying to hear better without being seen. "He's not his son, you know that. I've never told anyone, and I'm not going to start now," Natalie continued, her voice trembling. "Edward can never know that Peter isn't his biological son, ever. I lied from the beginning, faked the pregnancy, arranged everything perfectly. No one suspects a thing." Eleanor felt the floor disappear from under her feet. She leaned her hands on the counter to keep from falling. Natalie's words echoed in her head like a church bell announcing a tragedy. Peter was not Edward's biological son. Her daughter-in-law had lied for all these years. She had built a gigantic charade, deceiving the son she loved so much. "I arranged an informal adoption. Yes, it was all set up. Edward believes he's the biological father because I lied about the pregnancy. I used a prosthetic belly, Forged test results, paid people to help me. He never suspected a thing, Natalie continued from the other side of the garden, unaware she was being overheard. Eleanor felt tears well up in her eyes. She looked at Peter, that sweet, innocent boy who was not to blame for any of this. He was her grandson of the heart, he always would be, but the lie was too big. Edward deserved to know the truth. Her son had been deceived in the worst possible way. Natalie ended the call and came back inside a few minutes later. When she passed through the kitchen, she found Eleanor standing there, staring into space, her face pale. Their eyes met for a second, and Natalie knew immediately that something had changed. She felt a shiver run down her spine. "Is everything all right, Eleanor?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Eleanor didn't answer. She just picked Peter up in her arms, murmured something about going to read him a story, and left the kitchen in silence. Natalie stood still, watching her mother-in-law walk away, and a deep fear began to grow inside her. She knew Eleanor had heard everything. That night Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she should do. Tell Edward? Confront Natalie? Pretend she didn't know anything? Every option seemed wrong, every path seemed to lead to a tragedy. She thought of Peter, that innocent boy who loved his father and was loved by him. What would happen if the truth came out? Edward would be devastated. The whole family would fall apart. But the lie was too big to be ignored. Edward had a right to know. He deserved the truth, no matter how painful it might be. In the following days, Eleanor noticed that Natalie began to watch her differently. Her daughter-in-law would pass by her with a suspicious look, asking subtle questions to try and find out how much her mother-in-law really knew. The tension inside that luxurious house grew with each passing day, like a pressure cooker about to explode. Edward, oblivious to it all, continued his busy work routine. He left early, came home late, and in the few moments he was at home, he tried to divide his time between his wife, his son, and his mother. He noticed that something was off, that the atmosphere was heavy, but he attributed it all to work stress and the small, natural differences of a family living under the same roof. A week after that fateful afternoon, Natalie announced at dinner that she had planned a trip to the family's country estate. It was a rural property that had belonged to Edward's parents, located about 2 hours from Oak Creek, in a remote and quiet area. The place had been inherited by Edward years ago, but they rarely went there. "I think it will be good for us to get some rest," Natalie said, smiling forcedly. "Take Peter to get in touch with nature, breathe some fresh air. And you're coming too, Eleanor. It will do us all good." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at Natalie and saw something in her daughter-in-law's eyes that frightened her. There was a determination there, a coldness she had never seen before. She wanted to refuse, to make up some excuse, but Edward was already excited about the idea, talking about how long it had been since he'd been to the estate, and how nice it would be to spend a weekend as a family. "It'll be great, Mom, you'll love it. The place is beautiful, very peaceful. We'll all go together," Edward said, holding his mother's hand affectionately. Eleanor had no choice but to accept. But that night, as she packed her small bag, she felt a weight on her chest she couldn't explain. Something was wrong. Very wrong. 2 days before the trip, Natalie made a call to the estate's caretaker, a man named Mr. Miller, who had looked after the property for years. Eleanor was passing by the hallway when she overheard part of the conversation. "Mr. Miller, I need you to prepare something for me at the estate. It's a bit urgent," Natalie said, her voice low and hurried. "I need you to dig a trench out back near the lake. A deep trench, you know, it's for a landscaping project, a new garden I want to make." Eleanor stopped walking. Her heart raced. A trench? For what? She leaned against the wall, trying to hear more. "No, you don't need to worry about the exact size. It just needs to be deep and wide. Enough. I'll explain better when I get there. Oh, and Mr. Miller, don't mention this to anyone, okay? It's a surprise I want to do for Edward." When Natalie hung up the phone, Eleanor was already back in her room, locked inside, her heart pounding erratically. A trench. Natalie was having a trench dug before the trip. The old woman was no fool. She had lived long enough to recognize when something very bad was being planned. That same night, Eleanor received a text message on her phone. It was from an unknown, unidentifiable number. The message was short, but terrifying. Be careful. She knows you know. Don't go to the estate. Eleanor read and reread that message dozens of times. Who had sent it? How did this person know everything? She thought about showing it to Edward, about telling him everything immediately, but fear paralyzed her. What if she was wrong? What if she was going crazy? What if telling the truth put Peter in danger? She decided she would go to the estate. She couldn't abandon her grandson. She couldn't leave him alone with Natalie, not now that she knew everything. She needed to be close to protect him somehow. On the morning of the trip, Edward drove cheerfully, reminiscing about the childhood memories he had of the estate. Natalie was next to him in the passenger seat, silent, looking out the window. Eleanor and Peter were in the back. The boy was asleep, leaning on his grandmother's shoulder, and she stroked his hair tenderly, trying to commit that moment to memory. When they arrived at the estate, the sun was already high in the sky. The property was truly beautiful, with an old but well-maintained house surrounded by fruit trees and a lake in the background. Mr. Miller greeted them warmly, helping to unload the bags. Natalie was strangely kind that day. She made coffee for everyone, offered cookies, suggested that Peter go play in the yard while the adults rested. Eleanor accepted the coffee, but when she brought the cup to her lips, she tasted something bitter, strange. She pretended to drink, but discreetly poured the liquid into a potted plant when no one was looking. In the afternoon, Natalie approached her mother-in-law with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Eleanor, come with me. I want to show you the lake. It's beautiful this time of day." Eleanor looked at Edward, who was playing with Peter on the lawn. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words wouldn't come out. She just followed her daughter-in-law in silence, her steps heavy, her heart racing. They walked for about 10 minutes until they reached an isolated area, far from the main house. And it was there that Eleanor saw it. The trench, large, deep, freshly dug. And it was there, at that moment, that everything fell apart. Natalie turned to her, her face transformed by rage and desperation. "You heard, didn't you? You heard my conversation that day. I saw it in your eyes. You know everything." Eleanor took a step back, but her legs were shaking so much she almost fell. "Natalie, please, we can talk. We can sort this out another way." "There is no other way," Natalie screamed, tears starting to stream down her face. "You were going to tell Edward. You were going to destroy everything. You were going to take my son, my house, my life from me. I can't let that happen. I won't let it." And that's how it all began. The push, the fall, the dirt being thrown, the muffled screams, the absolute desperation of a woman who at 68 never imagined her life would end this way, at the hands of her own daughter-in-law, buried alive in a trench dug especially for her. Eleanor fought with all the strength she had left. She tried to get up, clawed at the edges of the trench, begged, cried, screamed for help. But Natalie kept throwing dirt, muttering disjointed phrases about fear, about secrets, about everything she had to lose. The muffled sound of the earth falling on her body was the sound of the end. Or, at least that's what it was supposed to be. Until in the distance, far in the distance, a different noise cut through the air. The sound of a car approaching at high speed. The sound of the car's engine cutting through the silent afternoon made Natalie freeze. The shovel was suspended in mid-air, poised to throw another layer of dirt on Eleanor's partially buried body. Her eyes widened in terror, and for a moment she was completely still, like a pillar of salt. Panic seized every fiber of her being. Eleanor, still conscious despite the dirt already covering part of her body, heard the noise too. It was the only thing keeping her awake, the only spark of hope in the midst of the absolute nightmare she was living. She tried to scream again, but the dirt in her mouth and her exhaustion made any sound impossible. Her strength was at its limit. Natalie dropped the shovel and ran. Her feet sank into the damp earth as she tried to get back to the house, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would explode in her chest. She needed to clean herself up, to come up with an excuse to appear normal. But how? How could she explain the dirt on her clothes, the desperation in her eyes, the guilt stamped on every feature of her face. The car screeched to a halt in front of the estate house, kicking up a cloud of dust. Edward leapt out of the vehicle before it had even come to a complete stop. His face was transfigured with fear, his eyes red from crying the entire way. In his hands, he clutched his phone, where a video was still paused on the screen. A video that would change everything. Minutes earlier, while still in an important meeting in his Oak Creek office, Edward received a notification on his phone. It was a message from a number he recognized immediately. Peter's number. But the boy never sent messages on his own. He was still too young to use a phone without supervision. Intrigued and slightly worried, Edward opened the message. It was a video, short, shaky, clearly filmed by small, inexperienced hands. The image showed the estate's yard, then moved quickly, showing bits of the sky, the grass, until it finally focused on something in the distance. 2 figures. He recognized one of them immediately, even from afar. It was Natalie. The other figure was on the ground, and there was something deeply wrong with the scene. The audio was almost inaudible, but Edward managed to hear Peter's whispered voice, trembling with fear. "Daddy, danger. Grandma's in danger." The video ended there. Just a few seconds, but it was enough for Edward's world to collapse. He didn't think twice. He cancelled the meeting, grabbed his car keys, and raced out of the office, calling Natalie's cell phone dozens of times, which went unanswered. He called the estate's landline, but no one picked. "Tup." Mr. Miller didn't answer either. With every passing minute, his desperation grew. During the entire drive to the estate, Edward felt his hands tremble on the steering wheel. He couldn't stop thinking about what might be happening. His mother in danger. Natalie involved. Peter scared enough to film in secret and send a cry for help. None of it made sense, yet at the same time, it made all the sense in the world. All the little oddities of the past few months began to fit together like pieces of a macabre puzzle. Now standing in front of the estate house, Edward looked around for any sign of life. He shouted his mother's name, shouted his wife's name, shouted for his son. The silence he received in response was more terrifying than any answer could have been. That's when he saw her. Natalie emerging from behind the house, staggering, her clothes covered in mud, her face as pale as paper. She stopped when she saw him, and for a second their eyes met. Edward saw something there he had never seen before in the eyes of the woman he had been married to for 7 years. Guilt, fear, absolute despair. "Edward, I can explain." Natalie's voice came out weak, broken. "Where is my mother?" Edward strode quickly toward her, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Where is she, Natalie? What did you do?" Natalie burst into tears, violent sobs that shook her entire body. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Edward let go of her and started running, following the footprints in the damp earth that led to the back of the property. His heart was beating so hard he could barely breathe. He ran like he had never run before in his life. He jumped fences, dodged trees, followed the trail of disturbed earth until he finally reached that place. And what he saw there made him fall to his knees. The trench, the shovel lying beside it, and in the middle of it all, partially covered in dirt, his mother, Eleanor, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, who had worked until her hands bled so he could get an education, who had given up her own life so he could have a chance. There, buried like an animal, struggling to breathe. Edward doesn't remember exactly how he got down into that trench. He only knows that seconds later, he was digging with his bare hands, clearing the dirt from his mother's body, screaming for help, crying in a way he had never cried before. His hands bled, his nails broke, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. "Mom! Mom! Hang on, I'm here, please, hang on!" Eleanor opened her eyes with difficulty. She was weak, very weak, but seeing her son's face, she felt a wave of relief so immense she almost passed out. He had come. Her son had come to save her. She tried to smile, tried to speak, but all she could manage was a weak squeeze of his hand. Edward managed to get her out. He picked her up in his arms, ignoring the pain in his muscles, ignoring everything except the need to get his mother to safety. She weighed so little, seemed so fragile in that moment. He carried her back toward the house, tears streaming down his face. his body trembling with adrenaline and shock. Natalie was where he had left her, now collapsed on her knees on the ground, crying compulsively. Seeing Edward returning with Eleanor in his arms, she staggered to her feet. "Edward, I can explain everything. Please, listen to me." "Stay away." Edward's voice came out like a roar. He had never spoken to anyone like that in his life. "Don't come near us. Don't come near my mother." He went inside, carefully laid Eleanor on the sofa and grabbed the phone. His hands were shaking so much he could barely dial. He called for an ambulance, for the police, gave the estate's address, explained the situation as clearly as he could despite his desperation. While waiting for help to arrive, Edward knelt beside his mother. Eleanor was conscious but clearly in a state of shock. He held her hand, stroked her dirt-stained face, whispered words of comfort that he himself wasn't sure he believed. "It's okay now, Mom. It's okay. You're safe. I won't let anything happen to you." It was then that Peter appeared. The boy had been hiding inside the house the whole time, too terrified to come out. Seeing his grandmother in that state and his father crying, he began to cry too. Edward pulled him close, hugging his son and mother at the same time, trying to shield them both with his own body. "You were so brave, son, so brave. You saved Grandma. Do you understand? You saved her." Peter buried his face in his father's chest, sobbing. This child of only 6 had witnessed things no child should ever have to witness. He had seen the growing tension between his mother and grandmother, had sensed that something was wrong, and even with so much fear, had found the courage to grab the phone and film, to send a cry for help to his father. He had saved Eleanor's life. Natalie remained outside, sitting on the ground, hugging her knees. She was no longer crying. She was in a state of shock, staring into nothingness, muttering incomprehensible things. Part of her still couldn't believe what she had done. Another part knew exactly and was terrified of the consequences. When the ambulance finally arrived, closely followed by a police car, the estate turned into a chaotic scene. Paramedics rushed to help Eleanor, asking Edward quick questions about what had happened. Police officers entered the property, assessed the scene, and quickly understood the gravity of the situation. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, approached Natalie. She didn't resist when he helped her up when he read her rights. She just looked one last time at Edward, who was staring at her with a mixture of hatred, pain, and disbelief that she would never forget. "Why, Natalie? Why?" Edward's voice was broken, exhausted. "How could you do this to my mother? How?" Natalie opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she explain? How could she make anyone understand the fear she felt when she realized her castle of lies was about to come crashing down? How could she explain that she had reached a point where eliminating her mother-in-law seemed like the only solution? She was led to the police car. As she was placed in the back seat, she looked out the window and saw Edward holding Peter, watching the paramedics load Eleanor into the ambulance. That image would be forever etched in her memory. The image of everything she had lost. The image of the family she had destroyed with her own hands. In the ambulance, on the way to the hospital, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness. The paramedics worked quickly, checking her vital signs, clearing the dirt that was still in her airways, administering oxygen. Edward sat on the bench beside her, holding his mother's hand, refusing to let go for even a second. "Stay with me, Mom. Stay with me. We're almost at the hospital. Just hold on a little longer." At Oak Creek Regional Hospital, Eleanor was immediately taken to the emergency room. Edward had to stay in the waiting area, and for the first time since it all began, he found himself alone with his thoughts. And it was terrifying. He tried to understand what had happened, tried to process how his wife, the woman he shared a bed with every night, the mother of his child, had tried to murder his own mother. Nothing made sense. Absolutely nothing. Peter was sitting beside him, too quiet for a child. The boy was holding a toy a kind nurse had given him, but he wasn't playing with it. He just stared down the hallway where his grandmother had disappeared, waiting, just like his father, for news. They waited for 3 hours. 3 hours that felt like 3 years. Edward paced the waiting room, drank 5 cups of water that didn't quench his thirst, and answered dozens of calls from friends and employees worried about his sudden absence. He didn't know what to tell anyone. How do you explain the unexplainable? Finally, a doctor approached. He was a young man with a tired but kind look in his eyes. "Mr. Edwards, your mother is stable. She had a severe panic attack, dehydration, some minor injuries, and she's in a state of intense emotional shock, but physically she's going to recover. It was a very close call. If you had been a few minutes later—" The doctor didn't need to finish the sentence. Edward understood perfectly. He covered his face with his hands and finally let the tears flow freely. They were tears of relief, of pain, of anger, of gratitude. A whirlwind of emotions he could no longer control. "Can I see her?" "Yes, but she's sedated. She'll be asleep for a few hours. It's for the best right now. You can stay in the room if you'd like." Edward took Peter by the hand and followed the doctor down the white hospital corridors until they reached a private room. There she was, Eleanor, his mother, lying in the hospital bed, connected to monitors, her face still smudged with dirt, despite the quick cleaning they had done, but alive. Alive. He pulled a chair close to the bed, sat Peter on his lap, and just stayed there, watching her chest rise and fall in a steady rhythm. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, the sound of life continuing, the sound of a second chance. While Eleanor slept under sedation at the hospital, on the other side of town, at a police station, Natalie was being interrogated. She was no longer crying. She was emotionally numb, answering questions automatically as if she were talking about someone else's life. "Why did you try to do this to your mother-in-law?" The detective in charge of the case was an experienced man who had seen a lot in his life, but even he was shocked by this story. Natalie was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she began to speak. And once she started, she couldn't stop. She told them everything, every detail of the lie she had built over the years, how she had faked a pregnancy to hold on to Edward, how she had arranged an informal adoption through shady intermediaries, paying a considerable sum to get a baby with no questions asked, how she had forged test results, used prosthetic bellies, and deceived her husband from day one. "I was desperate," she said, her voice monotone. "Edward was going to leave me. He was suspicious, thought I was only with him for the money. And it was true, in the beginning it was. But then I got used to that life, that luxury, that security. I couldn't lose everything. So I invented the pregnancy. I used silicone, loose clothing, lied about appointments. And when the time came, I said I'd had complications and the baby was born premature. I brought Peter home and convinced Edward he was our biological son." The detective took notes, disbelief written all over his face. "And why try to take your mother-in-law's life? Did she know the truth?" "She overheard a phone call of mine. I was talking to the person who helped me with the adoption, sorting out some final details to ensure no one would ever find out. And Eleanor was too close. She heard everything." Natalie paused, her hands trembling. "I saw it in her eyes. She knew, and I knew she would tell Edward. She loved her. Son, too much to let him live a lie, so you planned everything. The trip, the pre-dug trench, the coffee with sedatives. I didn't want to do it." For the first time, Natalie's voice broke again. "I didn't want to, but I was desperate. I was so afraid of losing everything. The house, the comfortable life, Peter. I love that boy. Even if he's not my biological son, I love him. And I couldn't let them take him from me." "But you were willing to leave him without the grandmother he loved so much." Natalie didn't answer. There was no possible answer to that. Night fell over Oak Creek. At the hospital, Edward remained by his mother's bedside. Peter had fallen asleep in his arms, exhausted from so much fear and emotion. A nurse brought a blanket and gently covered them both, a sad smile on her face. She didn't know the details of what had happened, but she knew this family had been through something terrible. Around 10 o'clock, Eleanor began to wake up. At first it was just slight movements, then her eyes slowly opened. She was confused, disoriented. It took her a few seconds to remember where she was and why. When the memories came flooding back, her whole body tensed and she tried to sit up quickly. Mom, easy. It's okay. You're in the hospital. You're safe." Edward stood up quickly, still holding a sleeping Peter. "Everything is okay now." Eleanor looked at her son. Really looked. She saw the deep, dark circles under his eyes. saw the pain in them, saw how he had aged years in just a few hours. And then she saw Peter, sleeping peacefully in his father's arms, and the tears began to fall. Did he save me?" Her voice came out hoarse, pained. "Yes. Our brave boy filmed what was happening and sent it to me. If it weren't for him—" Edward couldn't finish the sentence. He couldn't even think about what would have happened. Eleanor reached out a trembling hand and stroked her sleeping grandson's face. This small, sensitive, quiet boy had been braver than many adults would be. He had saved her life. "Edward," Eleanor said after a long silence, "there's something you need to know. About Peter, about Natalie." Edward shook his head. "I already know, Mom. She confessed everything at the station. The police called me a little while ago. I know that Peter isn't my biological son." Eleanor held her son's hand, expecting to see anger or pain, but what she saw surprised her. Edward looked at Peter with the same love as always, perhaps even more. "It doesn't change anything," Edward said, his voice firm despite his tears. "He is my son. He will always be my son. Biology doesn't make a family. Love does, and I love this boy more than anything in this world." Eleanor smiled through her tears. Her son had become a better man than she could have ever imagined. Even in the midst of so much pain, he chose love. He chose to protect this innocent child who was not to blame for any lie. They stayed there, the three of them, in silence. A family that had been nearly destroyed, but was now rebuilding itself in a different way, stronger, more true. Outside, the city continued its routine, but inside that hospital room, amidst monitors and the smell of disinfectant, something important was happening. A family was choosing to continue. It was choosing to forgive the innocent, protect the fragile, and move forward, no matter how difficult the path ahead might be. The first rays of the next morning's sun streamed through the hospital room window, gently illuminating Eleanor's face. She had slept little during the night, waking up startled several times, reliving in nightmares those terrible moments under the earth. Each time she woke, she found Edward there, sitting in the chair beside her bed, vigilant, as if fearing she might disappear if he closed his eyes. Peter had been taken home by a family friend during the night. The boy needed to rest in his own bed, away from the hospital environment that only brought more anxiety. Edward had been reluctant to let him go, but he knew it was for the best. Before leaving, Peter had given his grandmother a long kiss on the forehead and whispered that he loved her. Those simple words were the best medicine Eleanor could have received. A nurse entered the room with breakfast. She was an older woman, with a kind smile and eyes that showed she had seen a lot in her life. "Good morning, Eleanor. How are you feeling today?" Eleanor tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "Better, I think. Better." The nurse helped her sit up in bed, adjusting the pillows behind her back. Edward stood up and came closer, holding his mother's hand. "The doctor will be in to check on you shortly. If everything looks good, you might be discharged later today," the nurse explained as she arranged the breakfast tray. Eleanor looked at her son and saw the worry etched on his face. He looked like he had aged 10 years in one night. His eyes were red and swollen, and the stubble on his chin gave him a disheveled look that didn't match the always well-groomed Edward she knew. "Son, you need to go home and rest for a bit. Take a shower, eat a proper meal." "I'm not leaving here, Mom. Not until you leave with me." Eleanor squeezed his hand. She knew that determination. It was the same he had shown as a child, when he decided he would study no matter how tired he was, when he decided he would succeed in life no matter the obstacles. Her son had inherited her stubbornness, and at that moment she was grateful for it. The doctor arrived just before 9 o'clock. He ran a series of tests, checked her vital signs, and asked how Eleanor was feeling. He seemed pleased with her physical recovery, but his expression grew more serious when he addressed her emotional state. "Eleanor, physically you are recovering well, but given what happened, I strongly recommend that you seek psychological counseling. What you went through was extremely traumatic. It's not something you get over overnight." Eleanor nodded. She knew he was right. Even here, in the safety of this hospital room with her son by her side, she could still feel the weight of the earth on her body, still here. Natalie's screaming voice, still feel the absolute desperation of those moments when she thought she was going to die. "I'll take care of everything, doctor," Edward intervened. "My mother will have all the support she needs." The doctor signed the discharge papers with a few recommendations and prescribed medications. An hour later, Eleanor was leaving the hospital on her son's arm. Outside, a few reporters had already gathered. The news of what had happened had leaked overnight, and now the local press wanted details. The attempted murder involving the family of a well-known entrepreneur had become the most talked-about topic in the city. Edward tried to shield his mother from the cameras and microphones that were thrust toward them, but it was impossible to avoid completely. Questions came from all sides. "Eleanor, how are you feeling? Is it true your daughter-in-law tried to bury you alive? Mr. Edwards, will you remain married to Natalie? Are you going to press charges against your daughter-in-law?" Edward ignored all the questions and helped his mother into the car. As soon as he closed the door, he took a deep breath, trying to control the anger he felt at the invasion of privacy. But he knew this was just the beginning. The story was too sensational for the media to ignore. On the way home, Eleanor stared out the window in silence. The city looked the same as always, people going about their normal lives. But for her, everything had changed. The world seemed different now, more fragile, more dangerous, as if at any moment the ground could open up beneath her feet again. "Mom, I was thinking," Edward broke the silence. "Maybe it would be better for you to stay in the main house for a while, or we could rent a separate apartment where you'd have more privacy and peace." Eleanor shook her head. "I don't want to run away, Edward. That house is my home too, and most importantly, I'm not going to stay away from Peter. He needs me now more than ever." Edward smiled sadly. His mother had always been like that, strong even when she seemed broken, more concerned about others than about herself. When they arrived home, Peter was waiting at the door. As soon as he saw his grandmother, he ran and threw himself into her arms, crying. Eleanor hugged him with all the strength she had, feeling the tears return to her own eyes. This boy, this brave, sensitive boy who had saved her life. "Grandma, I was so scared you wouldn't come back," Peter sobbed against her chest. "It's okay, my love. It's all okay now. Grandma is here. She's alive and she's here with you." They stood there, hugging for long minutes in the doorway, with Edward watching the scene, his heart aching. The connection between his mother and his son was something special, something that no one, not even Natalie's lies and betrayal, could destroy. In the days that followed, the story grew to proportions none of them had imagined. Newspapers, news websites, television, social media, everyone was talking about the case. Natalie had become the most hated villain in the city. Her picture was everywhere, accompanied by sensational headlines about the woman who tried to bury her mother-in-law alive. The family's lawyer informed Edward that Natalie was being held in preventive custody and would likely remain there until the trial. The charges were serious: attempted murder and fraud. She could face many years in prison. In addition, parallel investigations were being conducted into Peter's irregular adoption. Edward had to hire a team of family law specialists to regularize Peter's situation. He wanted to ensure that regardless of any revelations about the boy's origins, his custody would not be questioned. Peter was his son, and he would move mountains to ensure that was legally recognized. Edward's company was also impacted. Some clients grew wary, and investors questioned whether he could maintain focus on the business amidst such personal turmoil. But Edward worked twice as hard to prove he could separate things. His closest employees rallied to support him, taking on part of the load so he could spend more time with his family. Eleanor, for her part, began therapy sessions as the doctor had recommended. Twice a week she sat in the office of her psychologist, Dr. Helen, and tried to process everything that had happened. It wasn't easy. There were days she could barely speak, just cried through the entire session. Other days anger took over, and she would shout about the injustice of it all, about how she had been betrayed in the worst possible way. "It's natural to feel anger, Eleanor," Dr. Helen would say patiently. "You were the victim of something horrific. Allowing yourself to feel these emotions is part of the healing process." But what hurt Eleanor the most wasn't what Natalie had tried to do to her. It was thinking about Peter. That boy had witnessed things no child should ever witness. He had been put in the middle of an impossible situation, forced to choose between his mother and his grandmother, forced to take an action that saved one life but destroyed another. Peter was also in therapy. A child psychologist specializing in trauma was working with him, trying to help him process everything in a healthy way. The boy had frequent nightmares, waking up crying in the middle of the night, calling for his grandmother. Edward slept in his room with him now, leaving a light on and the door open, trying to provide the security his son so desperately needed. A month after the events, Natalie's lawyer requested a meeting with Edward. She wanted to negotiate. Natalie was willing to confess to everything formally, to cooperate fully with the justice system in exchange for a reduced sentence. She also wanted to relinquish all rights to Peter, signing the papers that would grant full and irrevocable custody to Edward. Edward listened to the proposal in silence, his face a mask of restraint. Part of him wanted to refuse, wanted Natalie to pay the maximum price for everything she had done. But another part, the rational part, knew that a full confession would help close the case more quickly, avoiding a long and painful trial that would only cause more suffering for everyone, especially Peter. "I need to talk to my mother before I make any decision," he said finally. That evening, Edward sat with Eleanor on the porch. The sky was full of stars, and the gentle night breeze brought a pleasant coolness. He told her about the lawyer's proposal, waiting for his mother's reaction. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, looking up at the stars. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "Edward, I don't want revenge. I never have. What I want is peace. I want Peter to be able to grow up without carrying this burden. I want you to be able to move on with your life. If accepting this proposal helps with that, then accept it. But Mum, after everything she did to you, after everything she did, I'm still alive, thanks to you. And Peter, I'm still here. And that's what matters. The rest is just noise." Eleanor held her son's hand. "The best revenge we can have against Natalie is to be happy, to continue being a family, to not let her evil destroy the love that exists between us." Edward felt tears well up in his eyes. His mother, even after nearly losing her life, still found the strength to forgive, to think of others' well-being before her own. He didn't know if he would ever be capable of having a heart as big as hers. The proposal was accepted. Natalie formally confessed to all her crimes, cooperated fully with the investigations, and signed all the documents relinquishing any rights to Peter. In exchange, her sentence was reduced from 25 to 15 years in prison. She would serve the sentence in a closed regime for the first few years, with the possibility of progressing to a semi-open regime depending on her behavior. On the day the final papers were signed, Edward had a serious talk with Peter. They sat in the boy's room and Edward chose his words carefully. "Peter, you know I love you very much, don't you?" The boy nodded, his big eyes fixed on his father. "And you know that no matter what happens, nothing will ever change that. You are my son. You will always be my son." "I know, Daddy." Edward took a deep breath. "Mommy did some very wrong things, things that hurt a lot of people, especially Grandma. Because of that, she's going to have to be away for a very long time. And even when she gets out, things won't go back to how they were before." Peter looked down. "Is it my fault? Because I told you what was happening?" "No." Edward pulled his son into a tight hug. No, none of this is your fault, do you hear me? None of it. You were brave, you saved Grandma, you did the right thing, and I am so proud of you." "But I miss Mommy sometimes," Peter admitted in a small voice, crying. "I know she did bad things, but she's still my mum. Is it wrong to miss her?" Edward felt his heart break. His son was dealing with such complex adult emotions for his age. He held the boy's face in his hands, looking deep into his eyes. "It's not wrong, son. Love isn't something we can just turn off like a faucet. You can love your mum and at the same time be sad and angry about the things she did. Both feelings can exist at the same time, and that's okay." They held each other for a long time, father and son, crying together, processing together, healing together. Eleanor watched from a distance through the slightly ajar door, her heart aching. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. The wounds that had been opened would take time to heal, but for the first time since that terrible day at the estate, she felt something like hope. They were going to survive this. They were going to come out stronger on the other side. 2 weeks later, Edward received a letter. It was from Natalie. She had written from prison, and the letter had gone through all the security protocols before reaching him. Edward hesitated for a long time before opening it. Part of him didn't want to read anything from her, but curiosity won. The letter was long, handwritten in a shaky script. Natalie apologized. She explained, without trying to justify herself, how she had reached that point. She wrote about her difficult past, about growing up in poverty, about how she had always dreamed of a better life. She wrote about how meeting Edward had seemed like the chance she had always waited for, and how the fear of losing everything had turned her into a monster she herself didn't recognize. She asked for Eleanor's forgiveness, knowing she didn't deserve it. She asked for Edward's forgiveness for all the lies, and most of all, she asked for Peter's forgiveness, for putting him in an impossible situation, for making him witness terrible things, for not being the mother he deserved. At the end of the letter, she wrote something that stuck in Edward's mind. "I know you will never forgive me, and I understand. But please, don't let your hatred for me destroy the family you have. Eleanor is an incredible woman, and Peter is a child blessed to have her as his grandmother. Take care of each other, love each other. And if one day Peter asks about me, tell him that despite all my mistakes, I always truly loved him. He was the only good and true thing in my life." "Of lies!" Edward slowly folded the letter and put it away in a drawer. He didn't know if he would ever show it to Peter. Maybe when the boy was older, when he could better understand the complexity of human emotions, the capacity people have for both good and evil. Life began slowly but surely to find a new rhythm. Eleanor returned to her routines, always closely watched over by Edward and Peter. She still had difficult days, days when the weight of the trauma was too heavy. But she also had good days, days when she could laugh, play with her grandson, and feel gratitude for being alive. Edward threw himself into his work and fatherhood with renewed intensity. He hired staff to help with the house and with Peter when he was working, but he made a point of being present whenever possible. Family dinners became sacred. Weekends were time dedicated exclusively to his son and mother, and Peter, despite everything, showed a resilience that impressed everyone. With therapy, with the unconditional love of his father and grandmother, with routine and security, he slowly began to recover. The nightmares still came sometimes, but less and less frequently. The smile returned to his face, shy at first but increasingly present. 3 months after the events at the estate, Edward made an important decision. He was going to transform that place of trauma into something positive. He would completely renovate the estate, erase the traces of what had happened there, and create something new. Something that symbolized a new beginning, hope, life. He talked to architects, landscapers, designers. Together, they created an ambitious project. The spot where the trench had been dug would be transformed into a memorial garden, a space of peace and reflection. In the center, a flowing water fountain would symbolize life that continues to flow, always moving, always renewing itself. Eleanor was consulted at every stage of the project. At first, she wasn't sure if she could ever return to that place, but as the plans took shape, she felt she needed to. She needed to face that space, to give it new meaning, to take away its power to haunt her. The first day she returned to the estate after the renovation was emotional. Edward and Peter were by her side, each holding one of her hands. They walked together to the memorial garden. Where there had once been upturned earth and despair, there were now colorful flowers, wooden benches, young trees planted in a circle, and in the center, the fountain, with crystal-clear water falling gently over smooth stones. Eleanor stood there for a long time in silence, tears streaming down her face. But they were not tears of pain, they were tears of liberation. That place no longer had power over her. It had been transformed, just as she was transforming. "It's beautiful, Grandma," Peter said softly beside her. "Yes, my love. It's very beautiful." Edward hugged them both, and they stood. There, the three of them together, listening to the sound of the water, feeling the gentle breeze, allowing that moment of peace to wash away a little more of the pain they carried. That day, Edward planted a special tree in the garden, a tree that, according to the landscaper, would live for hundreds of years. He named that tree Rebirth, and at its base, he placed a simple plaque with an inscription that summarized everything they had been through and everything they had learned. Where there was darkness, we planted light. Where there was pain, we cultivated love. Where there was an almost end, we celebrate a new beginning. 6 months had passed since the day that almost took Eleanor's life. Autumn was arriving in Oak Creek, bringing milder temperatures and a sense of renewal. The city had forgotten the scandal that had dominated the headlines. But for Eleanor, Edward, and Peter, those months had been an intense journey of healing and reconstruction. Eleanor woke up that Saturday morning with the sun streaming through the window of her renovated room. It was more spacious, with a comfortable armchair where she liked to sit and read. The walls were seafoam green, a color her therapist had suggested for its calming properties. In the kitchen, she found Edward making breakfast. Her son had developed the habit of waking up early on weekends to cook. It was his way of showing love and being present. "Good morning, Mom. Did you sleep well?" "I did, son. All night without waking up. It's been 3 weeks in a row now." Edward smiled. That was a huge achievement. In the first few months, Eleanor would wake up several times during the night, startled, reliving the trauma. Peter appeared, still in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. The boy had grown visibly in these months, not just physically but emotionally. He was still quiet and sensitive, but there was a new strength in him. "Good morning, Grandma." He kissed her on the cheek. "Good morning, my love. Did you dream of angels?" "I dreamed we were at the estate, but it was different. There were flowers everywhere and you were laughing, Grandma." Eleanor felt her heart both ache and warm. Peter's dreams about the estate had been terrible nightmares. Hearing him talk about a beautiful dream was a sign they were finding peace. During breakfast, Edward made an announcement. "I have some important news. I've decided to create an institute for neurodivergent children, children who, like Peter, are special and need an environment that understands their needs." Eleanor felt tears well up in her eyes. Her son was turning tragedy into hope. "And I want to name the institute in your honor, Peter, the Peter Edward Institute, because you taught me that courage has no age and that love is stronger than fear." Edward knelt beside his son. "You were 6 years old, you were scared, but you found the courage to do what was right. That's heroism." In the following weeks, Edward immersed himself in the project. He bought a large plot of land, hired specialized architects, and consulted with educators. Eleanor participated actively, visiting the site, giving suggestions, choosing colors. Peter also contributed, suggesting a library with large cushions, an art room with natural light, and a garden with trees. 4 months later, the Peter Edward Institute was ready. A beautiful and welcoming building, surrounded by gardens with colorful rooms, a library, spaces for therapy, and an outdoor amphitheater. The inauguration took place on a sunny Saturday in October. More than 200 people attended. Eleanor was nervous, as Edward had insisted she give a speech. Edward took the stage with Peter by his side. "Today we inaugurate the Peter Edward Institute, a project born from difficult times, but one that represents hope and the belief that we can choose love over fear." He spoke about the Institute's mission and its qualified professionals. "This institute is named after my son because he taught me true courage, but none of this would exist without my mother, Eleanor." Applause filled the air. Eleanor walked onto the stage, her legs trembling. Edward hugged his mother before handing her the microphone. "I'm not good with fancy words. I've spent my life working with my hands, not making speeches. But I need to say a few things." She looked at Peter. "Months ago, I almost lost my life. But my grandson taught me that even when we're afraid, we can be brave. He saved my life that day and every day since." She turned to Edward. and my son showed me that flowers can grow from ashes. This institute is proof that love always wins." She paused. "To the children and families who will come here, you are special. Here you will find a safe place to grow and be exactly who you are." The applause was long and emotional. Eleanor stepped down, arm in arm with her son and grandson, feeling a sense of completeness. Afterward, many people approached her. A woman named Carmen said, "You are an inspiration. Seeing you standing here gives me hope." Eleanor held her hands. "You will get through this. It will hurt, but you will discover a strength you never knew you had." In the following weeks, Eleanor received hundreds of letters from inspired people. A 23-year-old woman wrote to say she had reported her abusive ex-boyfriend, inspired by Eleanor's courage. Edward was also on his own healing journey. Natalie's betrayal had shaken his trust, but he was slowly rebuilding himself through therapy and his work at the Institute. Peter continued to thrive. He had found in art a way to express his feelings. In one special drawing, he depicted 3 figures holding hands under a rainbow. "That's us, Daddy. And the rainbow is because after the storm, something beautiful always comes." Edward framed that drawing and hung it in his office. 6 months after the inauguration, Eleanor received a call. It was from her social worker at the prison system. Natalie had asked to speak with her. Eleanor froze when she got the message. She spent the entire night sleepless, wondering whether she should accept. In the morning, she talked to Edward, who was adamant that she was under no obligation to do it, that she owed Natalie nothing, that no one expected it of her. But the more she thought about it, the more Eleanor felt she had to do it. Not for Natalie, but for herself. To close a chapter. To look into the eyes of the person who had nearly taken her life and show her that she had survived, that she had won. The visit was scheduled for a week later. Eleanor chose to go alone, despite Edward's insistence on accompanying her. She needed to do this on her own, with her own strength. The detention center was a cold, impersonal place. Eleanor went through several security checks, her heart beating faster and faster. When she was finally led to the visiting room, a small room with a table and 2 chairs, she sat and waited, her hands sweating, her breathing ragged. When Natalie entered, escorted by a guard, Eleanor almost didn't recognize her. The woman had lost a lot of weight, her hair was shorter and unkempt, and her face seemed to have aged years in just a few months. The prison uniform looked too big on her thin frame. But what was most striking were her eyes. Eyes that once shone with ambition and calculation now looked empty, defeated, carrying a weight that went far beyond physical imprisonment. They sat across from each other, the silence heavy between them. It was Natalie who spoke first, her voice hoarse from crying. "I didn't expect you to come, not after everything." "I didn't expect to come either," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice steady despite the internal tremor. "I know that nothing I say will change what I did. I know I don't even deserve for you to look at me. But I needed to say it in person, looking you in the eyes. I am so sorry. I am so sorry for everything." Eleanor watched her daughter-in-law in silence for a long moment. She looked for signs of falsehood, of manipulation, of the masks Natalie had always worn so well. But all she saw was genuine remorse, a deep pain that was consuming this woman from the inside out. It didn't erase what had been done. It didn't change anything. But it was something. "Why did you do it, Natalie?" "I never did you any harm. I just wanted to love my grandson and be close to my family." Natalie lowered her head, tears beginning to fall. "I know. And that's what kills me inside every day. You deserved none of what I did. Absolutely none of it. I was scared. So scared of losing everything I had. The house, the comfortable life, the respect, Peter. And in the end, I lost it all anyway. Only I lost it in a much worse way. I lost it by being a monster." They talked for almost an hour. Natalie told her about life in prison, about the sleepless nights tormented by nightmares, about the therapy she was undergoing, about how she was finally confronting the inner demons that had led her to that point. Eleanor listened more than she spoke, trying to understand, not necessarily to forgive, but to find some meaning in it all. As the visit was ending, Natalie held out a sealed letter with trembling hands. 1. Day when Peter is older, when he's ready. Could you give this to him? It doesn't have to be now, but one day I'd like him to know that despite all my lies, all my terrible mistakes, I truly loved him. He was the only good and true thing in my life of lies. Eleanor took the letter and put it in her purse without making any promises, without giving any false hope. As she left, she breathed in the fresh afternoon air, as if for the first time. She had faced her tormentor and survived again. She had shown herself that Natalie no longer had power over her. It was liberating in a way she hadn't expected. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The months continued to pass, bringing more healing and growth. The Institute thrived beyond expectations. Dozens of children were already being served, and every story of progress, every hard-won smile, every transformed family was like a balm to Eleanor's soul. Eleanor had officially accepted the position of Director of Family Welcome at the Institute. She didn't have the academic qualifications for the role, but she had something far more valuable: genuine empathy, life experience, and a huge heart. She spent her days talking to families who arrived scared and lost, listening to their stories without judgment, offering comfort when words failed, and guidance when the path seemed impossible. There was a special room at the Institute that became Eleanor's favorite refuge. It was a small room with comfortable sofas, a large window overlooking the garden, and walls decorated with drawings made by the children themselves. There she would meet with parents for the first time, offer tea and create a safe environment where they could cry, vent, and find hope. Many of these parents arrived at the Institute exhausted from fighting alone, from being misunderstood, from seeing their children suffer. And when they left that room after talking with Eleanor, they left changed. They left knowing they were no longer alone. One afternoon, a young mother entered that room carrying a 4-year-old boy in her arms. The child was agitated, making repetitive hand movements, avoiding eye contact. The mother had deep, dark circles under her eyes and tears in them before she even began to speak. "I don't know what to do anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "Everyone says it's my fault that I'm spoiling him, that I need to be tougher, but I know my son is special. I just need help to understand him better." Eleanor knelt in front of the boy, respecting his space, and smiled gently. "You know, my dear," she said to the mother, "the love you feel for this boy is written in every word you say, and that's the most important thing. The rest we'll learn together. You're not alone anymore." The mother broke down in tears of relief, and Eleanor hugged her, knowing exactly what it felt like to be alone, what it was like to desperately need someone who understood. Edward balanced his company with the Institute, dedicating himself equally to both. He had found a renewed purpose in life. And Peter flourished. He was growing up healthy, confident, surrounded by love. He knew his story, knew there were complexities in his origin, but he also knew he was deeply loved. A year and a half after the events, the family was gathered on the porch of their house. Edward had prepared a barbecue, and they were simply enjoying each other's company under the starry sky. Peter, now 8 years old, was lying in his grandmother's lap. "Grandma, do you believe people can change?" Eleanor thought carefully. "I believe they can, but only if they really want to. And even when they change, it doesn't erase what they've done. But the possibility of change always exists. Do you think Mommy Natalie will ever change?" Edward came closer. "Maybe, son. But that's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to take care of ourselves and love each other." Peter was silent. "I hope she changes, because everyone deserves a chance to be better." Eleanor hugged her grandson tighter. That boy had such a pure heart. Even after everything, he could still wish others well. Later, when Peter was asleep, Edward and Eleanor were talking on the porch. "Mum, have you ever thought about writing a book? Your story could help a lot of people." Eleanor laughed. "Me, son, I barely finished middle school. We can hire someone to help. Your story is powerful. It could inspire people." "I'll think about it." 2 years after that terrible day, on a sunny afternoon, the Institute celebrated its anniversary. A celebration was organized and Peter wanted to speak. The boy walked onto the stage, with confidence. When I was 6, I went through something very hard. I had to make a decision that no child should ever have to make, but my dad and my grandma taught me something. Doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always right. He looked at Edward and Eleanor. This institute exists because bad people did bad things, but good people chose to do good things. My grandma almost lost her life, but she chose to live. My dad lost his family, but he built a new one. And I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about love. It's a choice. It's about being there. The applause was deafening. Edward and Eleanor were on their feet, clapping with overflowing pride. When Peter came down, he was hugged by both of them, and the three of them stood there, crying and laughing at the same time. The story that began with despair had turned into something beautiful. Eleanor looked around, seeing children running through the garden, families finding support, and she felt a deep peace. She had survived and thrived. Edward looked at his mother and his son, feeling gratitude. Yes, he had lost his marriage and been betrayed. But he had gained clarity on what truly mattered. He had his mother, he had his son, he had a purpose. It was more than enough. And Peter, looking at the adults he loved, felt safe. He knew his story was complicated, but he also knew he was loved unconditionally. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The lights of the institute came on, creating a warm, welcoming glow. When everyone had gone home, only Edward, Eleanor, and Peter remained. They walked through the memorial garden at the renovated estate, now an annex of the institute. They stopped in front of the rebirth tree, which had already grown considerably. "It's amazing how much it's grown," Peter observed. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "Just like us." Edward put one arm around his mother and the other around his son. "You know what I've learned? I've learned that the end is never really the end. It's always the beginning of something else. We just have to be brave enough to see it." Eleanor nodded. "And I've learned that the truth, no matter how much they try to bury it, always finds a way to breathe again. Just like I did." Peter held both their hands. "And I learned that family is who stands by you when everything falls apart. It's who helps you rebuild. It's love that doesn't give up." The three of them stood there as night fell, watching the tree that symbolized everything they had overcome. A tree that would continue to grow just as they would continue to grow. The story that almost ended in a grave had become a legacy of love, courage, and hope. And so, Eleanor, the woman who was once almost buried alive, became a symbol of strength and rebirth, reminding everyone that as long as there is life, there is always a chance to begin again. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Eleanor, Edward, and Peter has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of overcoming, courage, and unconditional love, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Every day, we bring intense and engaging stories like this one, which reveal the deepest and most resilient side of the human soul. Your presence here is very important to us. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions